One. Now we all know that in the circumstances, particularly after the presentation of the budget by the Union Finance Minister on 1st February this year, but she announced that 2 of the public sector banks will be privatized. The situation has totally changed. And so far as our union is concerned, our federation is concerned, we are totally committed to maintain the public sector character of the public sector banks of the country. And we are fighting for the last 3 decades. As we all know that just recently, we have completed 30 years of the presentation of the budget in 1991, from where a change in the economic policies of the country has taken place. Now, so far as our fight is concerned, it is not only for our job security or for our interest only. The bank employee movement of the country is fighting to maintain the public sector character of the banks, because the public sector banks has rendered a wonderful service to the nation and its people. Particularly at the times of crisis, it is altogether very much evident. Now, we all know that the country is going through a pandemic. Started about 16, 17 months ago, since March 2020. And it is also a fact that when the whole country was put under national lockdown, totally the public transport was suspended. It was the banks who rendered services. And particularly when total lockdown was there, the banks, those skeleton in service, so far as working hours and people are concerned, for quite obvious reasons. But it served the nation as a whole during that crucial period also. Now, so far as crediting money to the accounts of the beneficiaries, the direct benefits transfer system, if we go by 2021 financial year, in 54 ministries of Government of India and 319 government schemes, it was 5,53,000 crores amount of money was transferred to the beneficiaries' accounts. And particularly, so far as the flagship program of the Government of India is concerned, if we take Prime Minister Jan Dhan Yojana account, PMJDY account, about 23 crore female PMJDY accounts were credited 500 rupees each for 3 consecutive months. And we all know that 97% of these PMJDY accounts were owned by public sector banks and the regional rural banks. So it can easily be understood that the whole amount of these transactions were routed through the public sector banks as a whole. And it is not only the brick and mortar banking of the country itself. Since quite some few years, as a part of the financial inclusion plan, the unbanked villages of the country is being serviced by the customer service point, and the people who are giving service are known as business correspondents. Right at the moment, more than 5,50,000 business correspondents are serving to the people in the rural villages. And particularly when the banks were also running under some restrictions, it was the business correspondents who gave human service to the nation and its people in the villages. And most of these transactions were done from the customer service points. Aptly exported by the nation, these business correspondents are mostly engaged by the public sector banks as a whole. So when we are fighting against the privatization of the public sector banks, it is also with an interest, with a motive to maintain these services to the nation, particularly as last mile services to the people in rural and difficult places. So our struggle that is continuing for 4 decades since the 1980s, when a systemic effort was started and which gained momentum from the 2000s, it's to maintain these services to the poor and people living in the villages and the rural areas. So I think that these webinars are being held to renew our commitments to the struggle, which is bound to get momentum in the coming days, given the attitude of the government towards the opposition of their policies. So today in the third of this webinar series. We are very much privileged to have one of the eminent and outstanding economists of the country, Professor Patnaik. And today's this seminar will be coordinated by the Vice President of our Federation, Comrade Padiala Venkataramaiah. So without taking much of your time, I would request Comrade Venkataramaiah to coordinate this program and move ahead with this webinar. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Comrade Debasish Basu, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and the President of Bank Employees Federation of India, Comrade C.J. Nandakumar, and all other participants of the seminar, which is the third seminar in the series of seminars decided by Bank Employees Federation of India on the subject of Save Public Sector Banks for the country and its people. The importance and other things, Comrade General Secretary has introduced before the webinar. The present dispensation at the center has declared and repeatedly reiterating that it is not the business of the government to be in business. It is not a new slogan to the world. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan declared this during late 70s, which is nothing but free market economy. Ultimately, after 2.5–3 decades implementation of this free market economy, the world economy has collapsed in the form of World Financial Crisis 2008. Moreover, the free market economy couldn't answer not a single issue of the people like unemployment, hunger, or poverty. No issue has been addressed by the system, but the present government is following this. Consequent upon the world financial crisis, we are privileged. United Nations has constituted a committee, that is high power task force, under the chairmanship of Professor Joseph Stiglitz, and India is represented, not represented, the economists, world-renowned economists. Professor Prabhat Patnaik was there in the committee, which was asked to suggest or recommend reform measures for the global financial system. So he is the very eminent and apt speaker for the today's subject, being a macroeconomics and political economy professor, understanding the implications of the free market economy and the devastation it has created in the world. Unfortunately, the present government is following the same path even after the failures. So in that background only, the government has declared Atmanirbhar Bharat and other schemes, privatizing all the public sector units and handing over the entire economy to the private corporates. So in this background, Professor Prabhat Patnaik needs no introduction to the participants in the meeting. Many of the participants are followers and studying regularly Professor Prabhat Patnaik's articles in different forms. So without taking further time, I request Professor Prabhat Patnaik to address this webinar organized by Bank Employees Federation of India. Over to Prabhat Patnaik.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Comrade Venkataramaiah. Comrade Bosu Chaudhary has already suggested that the matter of bank nationalization is not just a trade union issue. It is an issue that deeply affects the nation. And that is why I would like to expand on that particular theme. Why were banks nationalized in the first place? You see, the anti-colonial struggle in India was actually a multi-class struggle. That it was a struggle in which the bourgeoisie was a participant, in which the workers were participants, in which the peasants were participants. It was a multi-class struggle against colonialism, against imperialism. And it was a struggle, if you like, of the nation in the making. That basically our nation came into being in the process of that anti-colonial struggle. Now, this formation of the nation, this concept of anti-colonial nationalism was very unique. It had nothing like this had been seen in world history. In the European countries, the concept of nationalism began in the 17th century, and it had a number of characteristics which were vastly different from the concept of nationalism that really developed, not just in India, but in a number of third world countries during their anti-colonial. One difference was that European nationalism always had an enemy within. The Jews everywhere, the Catholics in Northern Europe, in Protestants in Southern Europe, they always had, it was a concept of nationalism, which was a majoritarian concept of nationalism. Secondly, it was a concept of nationalism which actually included imperialism. It included the nation fighting against other nations in order to acquire empires. 17th century was the beginning of imperialism. Ireland was the first country that was colonized by Britain, and therefore the various nations in Europe went around all over the globe fighting against one another to acquire empires. Thirdly, and importantly, the nation was supposed to be placed above the people. The people made sacrifices for the nation, but the nation did not serve the people. The idea of the nation serving the people did not arise. The anti-colonial nationalism, on the other hand, differed in all these respects. It was an inclusive nationalism. There was no enemy within. You couldn't afford to have that kind of a divisive nationalism in an anti-colonial struggle when you're struggling against an extremely powerful opponent. It was an inclusive nationalism. Everybody was included within it. Secondly, it was a nationalism that, far from being imperialist, actually was making common cause with other countries similarly fighting against colonial oppression. Therefore, it was a nationalism that was internationalist, not a nationalism that was fighting against other nations. And thirdly, above all, as Gandhiji made clear, it was the nation was not placed above the people. The idea, the rationale of the nation is that it served the people. That basically the idea of the nation was to remove the misery and the sufferings of the people belonging to the nation. So in all these respects, it was a very unique concept of nationalism that developed in the course of the anti-colonial struggle. Now, when independence came, the important thing was to maintain this multi-class alliance, to develop this nation which had been in the making in the anti-colonial struggle, and to ensure that imperialism did not actually come back to dominate these economies which had become politically independent. Therefore, in countries in which the bourgeoisie did not occupy such an important role, the countries in which, if you like, it was the proletariat, it was the workers and peasants which led the anti-colonial struggle, the problem was different because they went on to build socialism, China being the classic example of it. But in countries like ours, where the bourgeoisie continued to be in a dominant position during the anti-colonial struggle, the development of this multi-class alliance, taking this multi-class alliance forward as a fight against the resumption of imperialist economic domination, posed a challenge. How to do that? And this is precisely where an economic regime was developed, which harnessed the bourgeoisie to it. In fact, it was an economic regime that in which capitalism also participated, capitalism operated. It was a regime in which capitalism was being built. But the idea was to have a controlled capitalism. The idea was to have the state dominating in a way in which the state could regulate and control capitalism. Now, this is something which many people have called differently. It was certainly not classical capitalism. In fact, it tried to check the tendencies of classical capitalism, and for that reason, the state was there in order to check these tendencies. What are these tendencies? One very obvious tendency of capitalism is that it tends to encroach upon and tends to destroy petty production, including peasant agriculture, craft production. Even small-scale capitalists tend to get destroyed by the operation of capitalism dominated by the big bourgeoisie. Therefore, it was important to protect agriculture against encroachments being made by capital. Therefore, you had a number of ways in which the state intervened in order to protect peasant agriculture. Peasant agriculture was protected from the vicissitudes of world market price fluctuations, because of which you actually had tariffs, quantitative restrictions. We had a price system here which was quite different from the prices prevailing internationally. And the prices prevailing here were supposed to be remunerative because they took into account the input costs of the peasants. And of course, you had the Commission on Agricultural Costs and Prices recommending for 22 crops what is appropriate remunerative price. And on the basis of that remunerative price, the government undertaking procurement operations and so on, in the case of food grains and likewise in the case of cash crops, commercial crops and so on. You had these various boards, coffee board, tea board and so on, which basically intervened, which had a marketing function, and they intervened to ensure that actually all these crops got remunerative prices. So the tendency of capital to destroy petty production, for instance, a handloom was protected, that a certain amount of cloth output was reserved for the handloom sector. So you had protection for the petty production sector, protection for peasant agriculture. Not that all sections of the peasantry were equally beneficiaries from this protection. Obviously, the well-to-do peasants became greater beneficiaries than the small ones. But the point is that big capital was not allowed to destroy peasant agriculture or petty production. Likewise, you had a situation where till then, imperialism had been dominating the economy. Imperialism had control over technology, which was a very important way of dominating the economy. And therefore, you had the development of the public sector in order to, confront foreign capital, in order to develop our own know-how, so that we would be able to become technologically self-reliant. And the public sector had great successes in developing domestically the modern technology, so that the country was relatively free of imperialism. Of course, the whole strategy, as I mentioned, was geared to making the development relatively free of imperialism, and technological self-reliance was an important element of that strategy. And of course, the public sector was an important means of achieving technological self-reliance. Now, it is in this context, it is in this, and likewise, the whole idea was that economic inequalities must not become too large, must not become too wide, because if they became too wide, then of course the unity among the people was going to get fractured. So the nation in the making would get disrupted, so that the whole legacy of the anti-colonial struggle would actually be lost. Now, this is something which versus capitalism, but is not classical capitalism. It was called by various people under various names, but it was not socialism, because the bourgeoisie was very much there. Capitalist development was taking place. This was called by very many people by very many different names. Jawaharlal Nehru called it the socialistic pattern of society. A very well-known Polish economist, Mikhail Kalecki, called it the intermediate regimes. Many others, I would like to call it the dirigist regime, the regime in which the state played an important controlling role, regulating role, even though it was a regime in which capitalist development was taking place. Now, this regime is one which I would not go into the contradictions of this regime, why it collapsed and so on, but this regime is something which was overthrown and substituted by the neoliberal regime in 1991, particularly. Many people date it back to 1985, but basically in 1991, this regime, this dirigist regime, was substituted by a neoliberal regime, which undid all, which tried to undo all these things. Now, one very important component of the dirigist regime was bank nationalization. Bank nationalization was a very key element of the dirigist regime. Why? Because typically, prior to that, big houses had their own banks, and therefore centralization of capital, enormous amounts of resources used to be mobilized in the economy, and these resources were put into the hands of the big capitalists to use as they liked. They used it for taking over small firms, they used it for speculating, they used it for their own investment purposes and so on. Now, if you're going to have controlled capitalism, if you're going to have a capitalism that does not encroach on petty production, that does not encroach on small capital, that actually ensures that these sectors also tend to prosper, in that case, you also have to earmark bank credit to these sectors. Then you cannot have a situation where all the bank credit is monopolized by the big bourgeoisie. Therefore, having a situation where credit that represents control over capital is not kind of pocketed by a handful of big houses. I mean, the Birlas had their own bank, the Tatas had their own bank, the Dalmias had their own bank. So it's not as if credit is controlled by a few houses, but credit is one which is socially controlled, whose distribution is socially controlled. That was an absolutely essential component of the dirigist economic strategy. Therefore, bank nationalization was not just some small measure. Bank nationalization was really a measure to carry forward the legacy of the anti-colonial struggle in building the nation. Now, therefore, in this context, in 1991, what you had, as I said, was the substitution of a neoliberal regime for the old dirigist regime. this substitution has been changing the structure of the dirigist regime down the line, across the spectrum, if you like. Firstly, this has meant that for cash crops, ICE intervention by the government to ensure that the peasants get a remunerative price has gone. You have all those tea board, coffee board, coir board, rubber board, and so on, which actually, are concerned with all these cash crops, but they don't have a marketing function anymore. As a result, you find that the peasants tend to get squeezed. In the 1930s Great Depression. See, I'm deliberately going into history because it is not often appreciated. You see, the entire anti-colonial struggle in India took off in a big way in the 1930s. Why? Because the peasantry joined it in large numbers. Why did the peasants join it in large numbers? Because the peasants felt the pinch of the Great Depression. The Great Depression brought about acute misery as far as the peasantry was concerned. And it is this misery which actually pushed them to say that, look, we are not going to be for this kind of a regime. We want a government that is going to save us, that is going to protect us. And the anti-colonial struggle made the promise that come independence, you never again face the kind of misery that you are facing now. Now, that is why the marketing function, or in the case of cash crops, was also important. It was exercised not through the Food Corporation of India, but through all kinds of specific commodity boards and so on. And the marketing function of these boards was completely done away with. And because of that, you had a situation where international price fluctuations then began to affect our domestic peasants producing the cash crops. Then they got into debt exactly as they had done in the 1930s, because if there's a price crash, they get into debt. And when they got into debt, then they couldn't pay back the debt. And many of them, as you know, committed suicide. 3 lakh peasants at least have committed suicides in the last 3 decades, which was unprecedented, unheard of, and certainly in post-independence India, it's a shame and a blot on the nation that so many peasants took their lives because of the fact that the protection of the state was withdrawn from them under neoliberalism. Then you had a situation where now you carry over the same attack on peasant agriculture, which began with the cash crops. Then there was an effort to push it towards the food grains. As a matter of fact, the international agencies, the WTO, has been, the US imperialism has been trying its best to roll back the procurement operations and the procurement prices as far as food grains are concerned. Okay. In fact, this has been the stumbling block as far as the Doha round of WTO negotiations are concerned, because they say that, look, you are giving them, the state is procuring too much, you just leave it to the free market. And that is what the 3 farm laws, which are now being enacted by the Modi government, are really trying to do. The Modi government is carrying forward the agenda which the US imperialism has been insisting for India to follow, and which no previous government really had the gumption to follow, because they knew that it's going to be resisted as far as the peasants are concerned. And this resistance is something that they were not willing to face. For Modi government, being a government of a neo-fascist kind, being a government of an extreme reactionary kind, has taken on the peasants in a big way. And the consequence of that is that for 8 months, you're having this peasant agitation. So the protection accorded to petty production and peasant agriculture under the dirigist regime is gone in the case of cash crops and is now going in the case, or attempted, government is attempting to let it go in the case of food crops. Now, likewise, we know about the fact that, that now the nation itself is fractured. You actually find that a segment of the nation, which earlier was with the people in this multi-class alliance, has now, as it were, defected and joined metropolitan capital. That basically Indian big capital now has itself gone global, and Indian big capital has got completely integrated with international finance capital. And that international finance capital is now in a position to enter our country, leave our country, and so on. We have a capital account that is reasonably open, not fully open as yet, but reasonably open, because of which no government can really afford to do anything against the wishes of international finance capital. Suppose a government wishes tomorrow to do something, and international finance capital would leave the country in large numbers because it doesn't like what the government is doing. And if international finance capital leaves the country in large numbers, then there will be a financial crisis and so on. So exposing the country to the free flows of international finance capital is a way in which the country's sovereignty gets completely undermined. No matter who you elect, they all follow neoliberal policies. And the World Bank and the IMF say they do so because these policies are very good. Not at all. They do so because all of them are worried that as long as the government is caught in this web of financial flows, any alternative policies not liked by international finance capital would immediately give rise to capital flight. Finance would leave the country in large numbers, and that is what's going to create a lot of transitional difficulties. Not in the long run. In the long run, it's very good for the country, but immediately it will create problems. And no bourgeois formation has the courage to really face those problems. Now, for a very long time, US imperialism has been putting pressure on India to privatize the banks. What is more, it has even suggested that, look, you don't have to privatize all the banks. Please, as a gesture, as a token of your belief in the virtues of privatization, privatize the biggest bank, that is the State Bank of India. Several American emissaries like Tim Geithner, Lawrence Summers, who are all their Treasury Secretary and so on, who are big financial bureaucrats in the US, have been coming here to India in the past and have been pressing the Indian government to do it. And the Indian government has not been able to do it precisely because they are worried that they are going to face a lot of opposition. They are worried that unions like yours are going to raise their voices against such privatization, and the people at large are going to raise their voices against this privatization. It is because of such privatization that credit was, firstly, this because of the nationalization, that the banks went all over the country. In fact, I remember some decades ago, every day, so many bank branches were being opened. The whole country became banked because of the nationalization. And secondly, bank credit was really disbursed much more widely. I remember as a student, as an undergraduate student of economics at Delhi University, we used to have to write tutorials. Why institutional credit cannot go to agriculture? And then we all wrote tutorials that transaction costs are high and this and that. But the point is that actually institutional credit went to agriculture after bank nationalization. And the Green Revolution was a product of that. Therefore, not only was the agricultural sector, peasant agriculture, petty production protected from encroachments by big capital, but they were in fact provided with credit precisely because of bank nationalization to ensure that they did not really have to go to money lenders, they did not have to face the kind of crisis and problems that they used to face in the pre-independence period, that they actually had access to institutional credit, and what is more, a certain proportion of the bank credit was earmarked as far as they were concerned. Then with the bank nationalization, again, a firm line was drawn between production and speculation. That basically nationalized banks did not indulge in speculation, even though after 1991, after liberalization, banks were, had a certain leeway. Nonetheless, when the 2008, financial crisis struck the world economy, Indian banks were relatively free of this. The only bank in India which actually faced some problems was the ICICI Bank, which is a private sector bank. You did not have nationalized banks facing any problems at all. As a matter of fact, it was found that the total assets of the nationalized banks that were held, the total foreign assets of nationalized banks and the proportion of their total assets was only 7%. And not all these 7% were toxic assets. As a result, they had a trivial exposure to all the toxic assets. And why was that? Because of the fact that with nationalization, banks were discouraged from speculating with people's money. So the emphasis on production, diversification of institutional credit to the small users, because of which green revolution could take place, and whatever else you may say about green revolution, it has made the country self-reliant as far as food grains are concerned. Self-reliant, admittedly, at lower levels of intake, but we are no longer dependent on the Americans. We are no longer dependent on what used to be called from ship to mouth, that food grains would come by ship and imported, and those food grains would go from ship to mouth. We are not a ship to mouth economy. And as a result, what is called food imperialism, the exercise of dominance by the advanced countries on the third world, because they provide food aid to the third world. India had experienced it till the mid-60s, but since that time, India has been free of this kind of food imperialism. And a very important reason for that is bank nationalization that has actually made credit available to the peasants to carry out the Green Revolution. Therefore, in all these ways, bank nationalization served the country in actually building up, if you like, the dirigist system, and insofar as the dirigist system has been attacked, large parts of it have crumbled, neoliberal regime has taken its place, but the neoliberal regime has still not been able to do away with bank nationalization, because of which the nationalized banks have still carried on with the good work they were doing, not fully. In fact, they themselves have slid back because of the pressure of neoliberalism. I'll give you one instance of this pressure. One peculiar argument began to be bandied about. What is that argument? That public sector banks are not profit-making. You see, the public sector banks were not supposed to be profit-making. The public sector banks were supposed to serve the nation differently from the private sector banks. The private sector banks emphasize profit-making. That is why private sector banks don't give credit to the peasantry. private sector banks engage in speculative lending. Speculative lending is something which is, of course, more profitable because it is more risky. But on the other hand, the public sector banks did not do all this. Because they did not do all this, somehow the argument got to be floated and the media picked it up that they're inefficient, which is complete nonsense because they were playing a different role. They were supposed to play a different role. In fact, their whole raison d'etre, the reason for their existence, the reason for their being nationalized was that they must play a different role. Before nationalization, many of you may recollect, there was a period of social control over banks. That basically, we don't really need to nationalize. We shall simply control the banks to make sure that they give credit to others. But no, that didn't work, because of which Indira Gandhi nationalized the banks. Bank nationalization was done in order to ensure that the banks play a constructive, different role from the private sector banks. Now, the private sector, if you are a private sector bank, you have to make profits. But on the other hand, this whole idea began that, look, they don't make enough profit. Look at private sector bank, they're more profitable. Completely bogus ideas. But unfortunately, in our country, these bogus ideas, particularly when pushed by the media, tends to acquire some kind of a currency. And this is what happened. But notwithstanding all the calumny against the nationalized banks, 2008 demonstrated that India was one of the very few countries in the world that was not touched by the financial crisis in US and the EU. And why was it not touched? It was not touched precisely because of the fact that Indian banks had not gone in for the speculative lending. And therefore, they held very little toxic assets in their portfolios, which is why they were immune to the kind of crisis that came. Now, it is in this context, however, that again the pressure has mounted, and we have a government that is, of course, neoliberal to the core, and what is more, it is extremely right-wing, adopting neo-fascist or fascistic methods in order to suppress dissent, in order to suppress opposition, and therefore the international finance capital and the Indian big bourgeoisie think this is a very good opportunity to do what could not be done earlier, namely have, at least some of the banks getting privatized. And then from that, then more and more banks will get privatized, with international finance capital being in a hegemonic role behind the neoliberal policies. You can actually see how banks are so important from its point of view. Here's a country which is pursuing neoliberalism, but on the other hand, the country has nationalized banks. So this anomaly, from their point of view, is what they are trying to get rid of by demanding that banks be privatized, maybe 1, 2 at a time, but slowly over a period of time, they must be privatized. Already, as you know, bank equity holdings, quite a lot of it has been privatized. It's perfectly possible for a businessman to actually acquire even up to 40% of banks, the equity of many banks, because of the fact that over a period of time, there has been a tendency to sell off, saying that no, government is holding majority holdings. But on the other hand, government holding majority holdings is something that is really not sufficient, because if a partner holds 40% of the equity, then that partner would have a say in the running of the bank. And already, therefore, to some extent, we have succumbed to the pressure, but not fully. And it is this which is galling as far as international finance capital and the Indian big business is concerned, because of which the pressure is again mounting that banks be privatized. Suppose we privatize banks. What is going to be the impact of it? You see, bank privatization is not an individual thing. As I mentioned, bank privatization is really part and parcel of the attack on the petty production sector and peasant agriculture that has been going on. One way of carrying forward that attack is to make sure that institutional credit doesn't go to them. They go to money lenders, therefore, private money lenders who have now started mushrooming again. They pay exorbitant interest rates. They cannot really pay back the debt, and therefore they commit suicides. And many of them give up agriculture altogether. Peasant agriculture is in a crisis. Between 1991 and 2011, 15 million cultivators have abandoned cultivation. Where they have gone, we don't know. These are census figures. Some of them may have become laborers. Others may have migrated to cities in search of jobs, but there are no jobs. The rate of employment creation in the country is less than the rate of growth of the natural rate of growth of the workforce. Therefore, in this period, you find that even the natural rate of growth of the workforce, which is because of natural population growth, cannot be absorbed because of this drastic fall in the rate of growth of employment generation. In that, if you have displaced peasants who flock to cities in the quest of jobs, then of course you get into a situation where there's an enormous widening of the pool of unemployed, underemployed, and so on, because of which there's a widening in the number of people who are poor. By the way, you must have seen everybody, I'm not talking about the pandemic, everybody recognizes that in the pandemic there has been an attack as far as, so many people have been pushed into poverty. Everybody recognizes this. So let's not waste our time discussing it. That's a well-known fact. Before the pandemic, the proportion of the people who are in poverty during the neoliberal period has increased. Now, nobody is going to give you this statistic because they fiddle as far as the definition of poverty is concerned to show that no, the poverty has been going down and so on. We are having 8% growth rate and so on. No matter what percent growth rate we are having, there has been an increase in poverty. Let me give you one or two figures. First, the proportion, let us take nutritional norms, because poverty in our country originally used to be defined in terms of whether in rural areas somebody had access to 2,200 calories per person per day. And in urban areas, if somebody had access to 2,100 calories per person per day. If you had less than that, you were considered poor. If you had more than that, you were not considered poor. That was the original Planning Commission definition of poverty. Now the point is that if you look at exactly that proportion in 1993-94 was in rural areas 58% of the total rural population. That proportion in 2011-12 was 68% of the total rural population. In other words, hunger, malnutrition, undernutrition, all of which were basically the core of the definition of poverty earlier, have actually increased. In urban areas, the proportion was 57% in 1993-94. It has gone up to 65% in 2011-12. What has happened after 2011-12? Even more horrendous. These are the years I've chosen, 1993-4, 2011-12, are years in which the National Sample Survey, which was a huge statistical enterprise. The Indian Statistical Institute, set up by Professor Prashanta Mahalanobis, in fact, used to carry out the National Sample Survey. Nowhere in the world did you have a larger survey than the National Sample Survey. It was a pride of India that actually here is an underdeveloped country, but that has such a wonderful, enormous sample survey. Statistically, it was unprecedented anywhere else in the world. Every 5 years, the National Sample Survey had what they call a large sample survey. But every year they used to have a small sample survey. The years I have been talking about, 1993, 4, 2011, 12, are the years of large sample surveys, which are really kind of major. The next large sample survey was in 2017-18. And you found in 2017-18 that the entire rural population had a decline in real terms in its per capita consumption, which was 9%. In other words, an average rural person in 2017-18 was consuming 9% less in real terms, in absolute terms, compared to 2011-12. Unprecedented in the history of post-independence India, unprecedented. And this is something which is a legacy of neoliberalism. Therefore, anybody who says the neoliberalism brought us great growth and so on, well, one doesn't eat GDP. I mean, GDP growth means nothing. Fundamentally, how have people fared under neoliberalism? And people have fared under neoliberalism through greater undernutrition, malnutrition, and hunger. They have done badly in terms of getting indebted and suicides. There's a crisis of peasant agriculture. And all this is something which the present government, unmindful of what's going on, wishes to push forward, which is why the peasants are demonstrating at the Delhi borders. So this pushing forward of the neoliberal agenda must be prevented. It must be prevented to ensure that the people do not suffer even more. Independence was meant for the people. It was not meant for big capital. It was not meant for the urban middle class, which may have got a few, which has certainly benefited from neoliberalism. It was meant for everybody. But on the other hand, vast masses of the people have actually become, in absolute terms, the figures I gave you, more hungry and poorer. Inequality, of course, has increased. In fact, some of the inequality figures are staggering. Two French economists actually looked at inequality in India from income tax data. Income tax in India was introduced in 1920. So they had access to all the data from 1922, and they found that the proportion of total national income which used to accrue to the top 1% of the population, actually had gone down to as low as 6%. 6% of the total national income accrued to the top 1% of the population in 1982. You remember in the old days, 1922 onwards, it was the lowest. And 1922 onwards, we had Maharajas, we had all those rich people and so on. And the proportion of national income accruing to the top 1% was 15, 20, 16, 18 and so on. And it had gone down to 6% by 1982, which is just before economic liberalization. But with economic liberalization, in 2013-14, it was as much as 22%. So imagine from 6%, the top 1% share in national income increased to 22%, which was the highest that it had been since 1922. In other words, the level of inequality in 2013-14 was higher than when India had all the Maharajas and Zamindars and so on, who were so rich and who got such a large share of income. So inequality has increased, but many people concede that inequality has increased, but on the other hand, they say, yes, inequality may have increased, but poverty has not. As a matter of fact, I'm arguing that the rise in inequality has also meant, in fact, a reduction in the consumption of the poor, and in fact an increase in the magnitude of poverty. Therefore, if this is the case, then what nation are we talking about? What nation building are we talking about? Are we remaining faithful to the Constitution? Are we remaining faithful to our anti-colonial struggle? Are we remaining faithful to the concept of the nation for which the people of this country made sacrifices and fought British imperialism? British imperialism was not fought so that only 1% of the population can really get enormous amounts of the growing national income. British imperialism had fought so that, as Gandhiji had said, wipe away the tears from the eyes of every Indian. Now, if you have to do that, then you have to have a regime that controls this rapacity, that controls this tendency of capitalism to encroach on other sectors, that controls the tendency of capitalism to deny credit to the other sectors by having control on the financial institutions. But if we are therefore going to prevent this tendency from going forward, if we are going to ensure that that the petty production sector, peasant agriculture, small capitalists do not go under, because if they did, then there'd be huge unemployment in the country. And even though you may have even higher GDP growth rate, the huge unemployment in the country would really create an ocean of destitution, because there'd be not enough jobs, and the ocean of destitution would actually increase naturally the measurement of poverty and so on. If we're going to prevent that, then we have to fight against neoliberalism. We have to fight against this extreme right-wing government that wishes to carry forward neoliberalism under the cover of the pandemic, by putting opponents in jail and so on, which has done the anti-farm, the three anti-peasant farm laws were passed during this pandemic. Similarly, the attack on the workers' rights was carried out during this pandemic. So we have to fight this tendency. We have to fight against the carrying forward of neoliberal agenda. Neoliberalism itself is in a crisis. Now, everybody, look what's happening in the United States. I mean, whether they are going to succeed or not is not the point. I mean, capitalism, whether it will allow them to succeed. But what is Joe Biden doing? What Joe Biden is doing is reviving the pre-war tendency of a New Deal, that he's actually suggesting that let us have income transfers to the people, income transfers to the poor, which is something that is going to generate demand so that we can get out of the crisis. Neoliberalism is at the end of its tether. Neoliberalism, I don't have time to go into why it's in a crisis, but neoliberalism is in a crisis. And of course, to get out of the crisis of neoliberalism, it is important to think of something else. While in our country, our government, in fact, to get out of neoliberalism, let's have more neoliberalism. Let's actually have even banks privatization, where everywhere the effort is actually to extricate the economy from neoliberalism. Whether they succeed or not is a different point. But the point is everywhere. The effort is to extricate their economies from neoliberalism, while here, the effort of our government is to push the economy deeper into neoliberalism. This effort has to be fought. This effort has to be resisted. And a very important component of that resistance must be the resistance against the privatization of banks, because that is a very key component, as I said, of the dirigism regime. And of course, now that that we have to ensure that banks remain the nation's property, and banks continue to give credit, institutional credit, to peasants, to agriculture, to small industry, to petty production sectors, and so on. So the fight against bank privatization is not just a trade union issue. Trade unions are in the forefront of this fight, but the fight against bank privatization is an issue for the survival and prosperity of this nation. It's an issue to prevent mass destitution. I think with that I shall stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. You touched upon right from the colonial war fight and emergence of the public sector and bank nationalization and their benefits to the nation consequent upon the nationalization and all other things. It was an excellent presentation and very educative to the participants. Thank you very much. I request the participants, if you have any doubts or questions, please use the chat box. I think already there are 3 questions. If Professor Prabhat Patnaik can see the chat box, let us start this with these questions, and any comrades having questions, kindly use the chat box and raise your questions. I think as of now, there are 5-6 questions are there already.
There are some questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
Do you think mounting struggles in agricultural sector will reflect in Indian politics and may lead to a systemic change? You know, comrade, I want to say one thing, that, you know, let us not look at it as a tennis match where we see one side, then the ball goes to the other court and so on. No, we have to be participants in this. So the point is not whether mounting struggles in agriculture will reflect in Indian politics and lead to a systemic change. No, we have to be participants in bringing about that systemic change. It's not someone else's struggle we are talking about, like in a tennis match. We have to be participants in bringing about that systemic change. We may succeed or fail. That's not the point. But I'm saying that, you know, epistemically, if you like, in terms of the conception, I would like to change your mindset from saying, is it possible, what's going to happen to the farmers and so on, to saying that we are a part of this struggle. We are going to make sure the farmers win their battle. Okay. And of course, if all of us have this attitude, then we shall actually say. On the one hand, Modi regime succumbed to US and enacted 3 farm laws. On the other side, they keep away from RCEP. How it will be explained, sir? Yeah, you know, I mean, they may keep away from the RCEP, but they are part of the Quad. So the point is that these are, you know, no government in India had been as close to the US and to Israel as the Modi government. I mean, Israel, they talk about Pegasus and so on. And Israel is really an outpost of US imperialism in Asia. So Modi government is closer to Israel and the US than any previous government has been. And of course, Indian governments have been tilting toward the US for some time, and particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, in terms also of the economic thing, this is absolutely clear. I mentioned that, you know, I'll give you, these things are not often known. I'm talking about the pressure of the US on the farm laws. Okay. Under the WTO, the US says that whatever was the price that the peasants had got at the exchange rate prevailing when WTO came into being, which was in the 1980s, would be the price that should be counted now as the benchmark price. If you give anything to the peasants above that price, then that is a subsidy. Okay. What is that price? In the case of rice, that price is about 250 rupees per quintal. In the case of wheat, it's about 300 per quintal. That's because that is the price which had prevailed, the dollar price that had prevailed in the 1980s multiplied by the dollar-rupee exchange rate prevailing at that time. Now, if you look at the current procurement price, the current procurement price for wheat as well as rice is at least 1,500 rupees, and that too is very low. It's very low. It doesn't cover their cost properly. And the US is now saying that this difference of 12 to 1300 rupees or 1200 rupees, this difference is subsidy. And multiply it by the total output which is produced, and you find that India is violating the WTO. So they would like us to reduce the peasant's price, or better still, the government doesn't intervene at all through procurement prices, leave it to the free market. In other words, they want to take this country back to the colonial period, when the peasants were left completely unsupported, when they were left completely without any protection by the state. That we have to resist. And the Modi government, through these farm laws, is bringing about that. It is a very simple and obvious case, and all of us must actually resist it. Okay, just 1 minute. I'm taking. Of course, the atrocities imposed on the people as a result of neoliberal policies the world over. What are the alternatives to prevent or resist neoliberal policy? How we will come out of it? Okay. The basic thing, okay, I mean, different countries would have different alternatives. I'm talking about in the Indian context. Basically, it is very important that purchasing power be handed to the people. The amazing thing, please think about it. The amazing thing is that even during the pandemic, forget about neoliberalism, even during the pandemic, when there was a lockdown, everybody lost their source of income. Large numbers of migrant workers trudged on foot to their villages. Can you imagine an independent India in which people trudge hundreds of miles to their villages? We should be ashamed of it. It's a blot on our nation. During that period, when they had no income, the government did not give cash transfers to the bulk of the people. India was one of the few countries. In the US, under Donald Trump, there was a cash transfer to every American. In the European Union, there was a cash transfer to every European, in every country, their citizens, but not in India. There were some targeted groups that got some transfers, but there was no cash transfer to every affected or every Indian who was, during the period of lockdown. So the point is, the first thing we have to do is to make sure that everybody has a minimum level of income. Many suggestions have been made. One suggestion is that there should be a basic minimum income that, many people have been suggesting. Basic minimum income was there in the economic survey. Arvind Subramaniam, who was the chief economic advisor, had suggested basic minimum income. Rahul Gandhi has suggested basic minimum income, and so on. But the problem with the basic minimum income is that it becomes the largest of the state. It's as if the state is being kind to give you a basic minimum income. I would make it a right. I believe that there should be at least five fundamental economic rights. We have fundamental political rights. We should have fundamental economic rights. There should be a right to food, a right to employment, failing which there should be everybody who hasn't got employment should be given a wage. So a right to food, a right to employment, a right to free health care through a publicly run national health service, a right to free education, at least up to the school leaving stage, and of course, a right to old age pension and indemnity benefits. Let this be a justiciable right, so that if somebody doesn't have food, that person can go to the Supreme Court and say that, look, I don't have food. The Supreme Court must pull up the government. So this must be exactly like the fundamental political rights. So the first part of, you say, what is the alternative? The first part of the alternative must be to ensure that, obviously, well, if these rights are there, then that means a transfer to the people. So the fundamental thing to do is transfer to the people. That will generate demand. And when that generates demand, then you'd be having larger output, then there'll be larger investment and so on. And that is the way the economy would revive. any amount of giving concessions to the capitalists doesn't raise demand, therefore there is no revival of the economy. And that is the stupidity of the Modi government. Okay, neoliberalism needs neo-fascism. Please explain in a few words. Okay, you see, neoliberalism if neoliberalism is creating all these problems with the people, why do they vote for it? After all, this is something, why do you have neoliberal regime? What is the base for the political support for neoliberalism? For quite some time, when the economy was growing at 8%, 9%, and so on, the political support came from the fact that, look, today, of course, you're suffering. Maybe you're becoming worse off, but the economy is growing. Tomorrow, you'll be better off, or your child, your son, your daughter would become better off. Therefore, as long as neoliberalism was growing, the prop for neoliberalism came from the promise of a trickle down. So it's growing rapidly. Some trickle down is going to take place. Your child would be having cushy employment and so on. That therefore there was a hope in people's minds, and that's why they supported neoliberalism. When neoliberalism has got into a crisis, that prop fails. You can no longer tell people that, look, tomorrow there'll be a trickle down and you'll become better off. And that is when what happens is a change in discourse, that economic issues are not debated. Then you say, oh, well, we are going to build a temple in Ayodhya and vote for us because we have built a temple in Ayodhya. So the whole idea is to change the discourse, to create an other, the Muslims, who are supposed to be people who are the other, who in fact are supposed to be the enemies of the majority community. And therefore creating differences among the people, creating an other, like I mentioned, European nationalism had done in the beginning, vis-a-vis Jews and so on. And Hitler did the same vis-a-vis Jews in the 1930s. So creating an other in order to get a majority for yourself, inculcating hatred in society so that people are divided. They cannot jointly undertake any action for their livelihoods. On the contrary, they are made to hate one another. These are the ways that neoliberalism finds a new kind of prop. That on the one hand, you have the peasants being squeezed, the workers being squeezed. On the other hand, the same UP, which is going to the polls, in which, in the western part, the peasantry is demonstrating outside Delhi, the ruling party hopes to win the UP elections by tom-tomming the fact that they have built a temple in Ayodhya. How great for the Hindus that we have built a Ram temple. And that being the case, vote for us. So neoliberalism requires neo-fascism as a new prop in a period of crisis when the old prop of a high growth rate and possible trickle down and so on has collapsed. Okay, why anti-privatization struggles are not getting enough momentum in India? Well, they are not getting enough momentum in India. And firstly, I don't see why you should say that they are not getting enough momentum in India, because after all, again, as I said in answer to the first question, momentum depends on you and me. As long as we remain committed to it, then nobody would have the courage to push through privatization. At least we have to fight against it. Whatever be the outcome, we have to fight against it. So in terms of methodology, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I mean, that's a defeatist way of looking at it. That's a tennis match kind of way of looking at it, which I don't like. That fundamentally we have to see that we are a part of it. And secondly, who says that anti-privatization is not getting the kind of mileage that? Look at the Kisan struggle. I have not seen such large-scale Kisan struggle since the 1970s, I suppose. Yeah, Since the emergency period, I have not seen such large-scale Kisan struggles in the country, and the peasants are. You see, the peasants have the right attitude. They don't ask, are we winning, are we losing. They are completely committed to their struggle, and they're going on with it. I think we have to adopt the same attitude, remain completely committed to our struggle, go on with it. And besides, this struggle itself is something which is now gathering momentum in a way that I have not seen for the last 50 years. Dr. Manmohan Singh claims that the neoliberal regime inaugurated by him brought millions of people out of poverty, raised GDP, generated employment. But for Modi's demonetization GST, the present devastation would not have occurred. Now, I gave you figures which predate. Yes, demonetization and GST are further nails in the coffin of petty production. They further squeeze petty producers. In fact, their objective is to squeeze. But on the other hand, I gave you figures for the period predating all these. I gave you figures for the period up to 2011-12, when nobody had heard of demonetization or GST. And I gave you figures about the growth in hunger and so on, and the growth in unemployment. You see, maybe I didn't give you the figure on the growth of unemployment. During the British period, during the period when the state played a major role, pre-liberalization, the Nehruvian strategy was being followed, you found that the average employment growth in the country, jobs created in the country, was about 2% per annum. All of us then used to criticize, saying that, look, the population growth is larger, it used to be larger those days, and therefore the workforce growth is larger. And if you have 2% job generation rate, then the unemployment would never disappear. Now, during the period that it is 8%, 9% growth rate, the job generation rate has become 1%. So Dr. Manmohan Singh is not right when he claims this. I mean, he claims it because he was the father of all this neoliberalism, but actually it's put under US pressure. But the point is that it is just not correct to say that that all the ills of neoliberalism happened only under Modi. Of course, Modi worsened things, but these ills were happening even before. Peasant suicide didn't begin only with 2014. It happened even before. So, I mean, unemployment, this huge growth in unemployment did not happen now. The huge growth in hunger did not happen now. So this has gone on for quite some time. It is neoliberalism that's responsible for it, and I've given you the reasons for it. Okay. They are the vote banks only by a dole of 2,000. Yes, I mean, this 2,000 and so on is just not enough. 2,000 per year is just trivial. Government is pushing for cashless economy, more GST on cash transactions being imposed in current financial year, which is making banks unpopular, a lot of grievances among MSME sector. Is this very requirements of not at all. This is, by the way, the cash to GDP ratio in in Germany, which is among the most advanced countries in the world, or in Japan, is higher than in India. So Japan is not going for a cashless economy. In Japan, which is such a developed country, cash to GDP ratio is about 20%. Similarly in Germany, but in India it's about 12 to 13%. So the point is, why cashless economy? What is there to show that the cashless economy is any better than an economy using cash? I mean, these are all issues in which the Modi government is doing, crony capitalism. There's some kind of, some Adani, some Ambani, somebody who would be actually doing some of these smart cards and this and that. And therefore, these are ideas which are either pushed by crony capitalists, or these are ideas which actually emerge when you don't have an understanding of the economic problem. Then you clutch all kinds of things. Any stray idea, let's do away with cash, then the economy will grow. The economy is not going to grow if you do away with cash. How are people going to get purchasing power in their hands? So these are just ideas which the government is clutching at. or worse still, is being pushed by crony capitalists. What is the weapon available to general people of India to stop privatization? Well, stopping privatization is something which really can be done with the opposition of the people. I mean, there's no special weapon which is available, but fundamentally people have to argue against it, have to write against it, have to demonstrate against it, have to what are the, yeah, okay. People are being affected heavily in all spheres because of the neoliberal, then why is there no massive resistance among the people? The cultural mindset of our country is a major hurdle. No, I think, let's be clear about one thing, that you see, I have seen this country 50 years ago. Okay. 50 years ago, if people's rights were affected, they would be out in the street. You see, there is a kind of dialectic about it that people felt empowered. We were a free country. I am a citizen of the free country. If it is the case that my right is trampled upon, in that case, I am going to be on the road demonstrating against it. But on the other hand, of late, so much fear has been put in people's minds that that they even feel scared exercising their rights as citizens. I mean, that's what fascism, neo-fascism, fascistic tendencies, quasi-fascism, call it what you like, that's what it does. It actually rules by a combination of fear and hatred. Hatred against the other and fear of the state. And therefore, obviously, there is less of a resistance, but on the other hand, resistance is building up, resistance is there. It is remarkable that even in this period, there is so much resistance among the people. And the very fact that we're having this meeting itself is a symptom of resistance. So resistance is there, and we have to build on that resistance. So it's not a cultural mindset. I have actually seen people move, I mean, I have seen strikes, I have seen people assert themselves. Do you think that privatization, opening up a banking sector to international finance capital may lead to capital flight and mount pressure on Indian rupee? No. Privatization would not give rise to capital flight. Privatization would actually attract more capital, possibly. But, attracting capital is not per se a good thing, because you attract a lot of finance. And that finance, let us say, is invested in the stock market, where it gets a certain rate of return. And in order to prevent an exchange rate depreciation, you hold that finance in the form of foreign exchange reserves. When you hold in the form of foreign exchange reserves, they barely earn 1%, 1.5%. They're held as Swiss bank deposits, or they are held at kind of US Treasury bonds. But US Treasury bonds now have trivial interest rates. The short-term interest rate in US now is 0. Even the long-term interest rate is about 1%, 1.5%, 2%. So attracting finance is not a great thing. On the contrary, the country actually implicitly is borrowing dear to lend cheap. Therefore, privatization would not give rise to capital.
Yeah. Professor Prabhat Patnaik, I think we left one last question in the chat box. From how do you explain the dichotomy between Mr. Biden's attempt of some sort of redistribution of income from top to bottom of American society, and finance capital's acceptance of that,
that's
where they know?
That's exactly what I was saying, that currently in world capitalism, There's a big churning. Why is there a big churning? Because it's in a crisis. You see, many people say there's no crisis. If there's no crisis, why should Biden be doing all this? There's a big churning because neoliberalism, as I mentioned, is in its death throes. Neoliberalism has reached the end of its tether. That is clear to everybody. You look at London economists, they're writing about it. So neoliberalism is in a very deep crisis. And neoliberalism is a favored policy of international finance capital. And that is why different capitalist governments are thinking of how to extricate the economy. And because of this, some of them are actually thinking in different ways. Not our government, but some of them are thinking in different ways. These ways are not necessarily the ways that international finance capital thinks. So when Biden says that, look, by the way, in the US this year, they're going to have a 13% fiscal deficit. As a percentage of GDP, the US is going to have a 13% fiscal deficit. Even the EU is going to have a 5% fiscal deficit, which is above the statutory 3%. So the point is that many capitalist governments, particularly in the context of the pandemic, but going beyond the pandemic, are thinking of ways in which they can get out of the crisis, even by defying finance capital. And then reach some kind of an understanding with finance capital. In other words, defying doesn't mean that you do away with finance capital. They're not thinking of that. They're not moving to socialism. But the point is that defying finance capital, but reaching some kind of a new level of understanding and in which finance capital can be somewhat tamed and controlled, but meanwhile the economy can be revived, extricated, and so this is a period of acute crisis and contradictions in capitalism. And because of that, the contradiction which, let's say, someone like Biden's administration, the policies it is visualizing and the policies that finance capital ideally would like to see, that is one manifestation of this contradiction. By the way, one of the things that, for instance, Biden wanted is that tax the corporates in order to finance these transfers. Now, if you tax the corporates and the corporates show their profits in some Cayman Island or in some kind of tax haven, therefore Biden suggested an agreement where there would be a minimum international corporate tax rate. Okay. And they suggested 25% as the minimum international corporate tax rate. Now, to that, many countries opposed. And the countries that opposed, in a sense, you can say this is international finance capital's opposition to the Biden measure. So finally, they reached a compromise that 15% would be the minimum international corporate tax rate. That's the compromise that G7 has reached and now broadly accepted by many third world countries. But you see, 15% is not enough because after all, there are many, small capitalists in the US also pay 25% 25% tax rate. So you're actually encouraging, in a sense, even small players to try and show their profits in Cayman Island or in tax havens. So this 15% is not really a solution to Biden's problem. But on the other hand, people had to compromise and so on. So I'm just giving that as an example of the kind of contradictions you find. Contradictions between the requirements for extricating the economy from the crisis and, of course, the insistence on a certain agenda by finance capital.
Thank you very much. It's a very lively session. For 1 hour 17 minutes by lecture as well as question answers by Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and spanning to 1 hour 35 minutes total session. Thanks a lot. I request Comrade Chiranjit Ghosh, Joint Secretary of Bank Employees Federation of India, to propose a vote of thanks.
Yes, Professor Prabhat Patnaik presented us with a very insightful and very inspiring lecture today. And we are more capable to take on our combat the present neoliberal attack, which is with the bank privatization, which will further damage us. And we are having one of the greatest thinkers of our times in Professor Patnaik. And we profusely thank on behalf of our Bank Employees Federation of India for this great lecture which he had which presented to us today. And I would take this occasion to thank the coordinator, our comrade P. Venkatramaya, and comrade Devashish Basu Chaudhary, who our general secretary, who started the program. And I would thank the nearly 3.5 hundreds of those who have participated this webinar. It was definitely, it must have given a very big boost to the movement. And with that, on behalf of Bank Employees Federation, I again thank Professor Patnaik, and good night to all. Good night to Professor Patnaik.
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Comrade Chiranjit Ghosh.
Thank you, comrade.
By this, the webinar is closed.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye, comrade. Thank you all.